Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nusessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center, and we're very pleased to welcome all of you to the Imagination of Hamlet. I've said this before, but I just love saying this. Please, turn your cell phones up as high as they can go. And the person who has the loudest cell phone will get a free edition of Bob Brustein will figure out Titus Andronicus. Anyway, I've just come back from Paris, and there's a wonderful show of. Does anyone know the novelist Irene Nemirovsky? Anybody familiar? Yes. Sure. It's a fantastic show at the Museum of the Shoah. It may have actually toured here at one point, but if you get a chance to see this show, it's really magnificent and very special. And anyway, that has nothing to do with today. Which, before we begin, I want to make a few other non sequiturs and sequiturs. The art exhibit you see on the wall here is art in the public eye, and it was related to our roundtable from the WPA to the NEA, in which we had the NEA chairman, Rocco Landesman, and the DCA chairman, both here, DCA of New York, and Kate Levin, and others, and to discuss arts funding. And so what you see on the walls here are Beatrice Caron's subway art on this wall here. Peter Siss's very well-known works you may have seen. These are all examples of public art. And so what I'm trying to do is call your attention to the walls, because a lot of times people walk into Philoctetes and think that the exhibits are gratuitous, which they're not. They're always related to and roundtable that we have had. Now, on November 6th, we feature a roundtable on Hitchcock's Vertigo called Finding Equilibrium in Vertigo, and it's organized by Yale film scholar Brigitte Poiker, who I think Paul Fry may know. You may know her a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. And she did an incredible roundtable on the Year of the 13 Moons here at Philoctetes a while back. So this year, again, we're going to be seeing the complete Vertigo after the roundtable. I believe. Adam, is it after that we're seeing Vertigo or before? Vertigo first. That makes sense even. That even makes sense. Vertigo first, then the roundtable. So come to that, because that's obviously an amazing movie, which has Shakespearean parallels, and you should come to that. Now, on November 11th, Our Life in Poetry, our ongoing poetry series directed by Michael Braziller, continues with Frank O'Hara, and Mark Doty and David Lehman, two distinguished figures in modern American poetry, will join Mike for that program. On November 14th, classical music continues at Philoctetes with Stephanie Chase presenting a program called From Muse to Music, exploring the craft of the American art song. And on December 5th, we have another really stellar panel on the graphic novel, the art of the graphic novel, and that will include Linda Barry, Hilary Shute, Christopher Couch, Ben Couture, a favorite of mine, and Francoise Mouly from The New Yorker. On December 12th, our improvisational jazz series, Living in the Musical Moment, inaugurates its first program of the season with improvisational structure for two keyboards with Lewis Porter and Mark Rossi. Now, we do want to thank the New York Council on the Humanities, who has sponsored this event. And now I'm very pleased to present Paul Fry. Paul Fry is William Lamson Professor of English and Director of Graduate Studies in English at Yale University. He has written on British Romanticism, the history of literary criticism, contemporary literary theory, and literature in relation to the visual arts. His book, The Poet's Calling in the English Ode, received the Melville Cain Award of the Poetry Society of America, and his most recent books are William Wordsworth and the Poetry of What We Are, and A Defense of Poetry, Essays on the Occasion of Writing. Fry teaches Shakespeare to K through 12 teachers at the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. His lecture course in modern literary theory can be seen online at Open Yale, Facebook, and iTunes. Paul will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. I should have included in your writing credits all the emails that went into doing this panel.
Yes.
Which I give you a thank you for.
Yes, well, I do try to write complete sentences. I'm very happy to introduce the panelists. I'm introducing them on short notice, and I'm afraid I have only what you probably have before you, which I will abridge. Then I'll say a word or two, not exactly to get the ball rolling, because I think it's probably already rolling electronically among all these great whirling minds, but simply to fill the air with words, and so that it can continue to be filled. To my left, I'm sure this is a gentleman who needs no no introduction for most of you. Robert Brustein. Well, I'm going to do my best. I'm not trying to wriggle out of it. He's a distinguished scholar in residence at Suffolk University. He's the past dean of the Yale Drama School. He's been a professor of English at Harvard. And he was the founding director of the Yale Repertory Theater and the American Repertory Theater, where he does continue to teach. Most recent books, Millennial Stages and The Tainted Muse, Prejudice and Presumption in Shakespeare and His Time. He has been a long-standing theater critic for the New Republic, and he has done many adaptations, of course, and he has himself written full-length plays. I have the impression, especially recently, and he has now completed a trilogy on Shakespeare, involving Shakespeare, the last of which features, I'm told, the death of the bard, is called The Last Will. And so this is this then is an inadequate sketch of an extraordinary career. Christian Camargo, gentleman across from me, is, I'm ashamed to say, I am told, because I have not myself had the experience, a truly remarkable Hamlet. One of the two roles he played with the theater for a new audience were Coriolanus. Don't know what part you did. Coriolanus and
I only do the big ones.
Oh, good. Okay, good. And Hamlet. He played the title role of Kit Marlowe in the Public Theater. Appeared in the world premiere of Steve Martin's Underpants, and has been a company member of the Globe Theater's inaugural season, where he was Henry V. I assume you were Henry V.
No, Mark Rylance was Henry V. I was the Dauphin.
Okay. And I assume you were not a chaste maid in Cheapside, but I suppose I shouldn't presume.
No, I was the reason.
And recently he has completed what I take to have been a completely exhausting world tour of the Bridge Project, where he performed in The Tempest and As You Like It. He has many film and television roles. He was in The Hurt Locker, just for example. I think I'll skip over this Paul Fry. Laura Levine, to my right, an associate professor of theater studies and drama at NYU's Tisch School, where she teaches Shakespeare, Renaissance literature and culture, and many other things, memoir writing, autobiographical performance. Her first book, Men in Women's Clothing, Anti-Theatricality and Effeminization, 1579-1642, is about boy actors and the sort of anxieties surrounding boy actors in the Renaissance.
Chaste maid.
And
I played one, though. I did.
And she's at work on a book about anxieties about witchcraft during the early modern period, and as well as a series of essays on ballet.
Halloween project.
Yes.
Students all
Eugene
say
Mahon,
witchcraft.
this gentleman here, is a training and supervising analyst at the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center for Training and Research, practicing child and adult psychoanalysis. He has a particular interest in parapraxis, or slips of the tongue, in Hamlet and the constructive uses to which they're put, also other plays in Shakespeare. He has also written an essay on the death of Hamlet, Shakespeare's son, in 1596, which I then evolved into a play. Is that right? Because Eugene is also a playwright, has written a number of fascinating sounding plays. I thought In the Company of Ghosts might be about Shakespeare, but evidently not quite. And Susanne Wofford, to my right here, is the dean of NYU's Gallatin School. Previously has taught at Yale University. We were colleagues at one time. It was a great pleasure. She was a fabulous lecturer on Shakespeare, by the way. And since at the University of Wisconsin, where she was director of the Center for the Humanities and also the Mark Eccles Professor of English. She's been on the Breadloaf School, and a visiting professor at both Harvard and Princeton. Princeton, and her work involves many early modern topics, but particularly Shakespeare. She has written Shakespeare, The Late Tragedies, and a very, very widely used and cited anthology, Hamlet Case Studies in Contemporary Criticism, and has a book forthcoming, The Apparent Corpse, Popular and Transnational Bodies on the Shakespearean Stage. Now, this is an overwhelming and awe-inspiring cast of characters. I'm going to get out of the way absolutely as soon as I can. Just really only a remark of my own. I suppose what interests me most of the many things that can interest one about Hamlet is what you might call vacillations in his intellectual framework, and this certainly can go in any number of directions. The question of religion, the fact that for the most part Hamlet seems to be an historically very accurately rendered pre-Reformation Catholic, concerned about purgatory, concerned about the provenance of the ghost, instantly prepared to say in any state of heightened fear, angels and ministers of grace defend us. A person whose religious sensibility seems particularly acute among Shakespearean characters, yet who is the same person who, in what we all learned in school to be or not to be, seems rather to be in an extremely existentialist frame of mind, much closer really to Claudio in Measure for Measure, I but to die and go we know not where. Hamlet speaks having seen a ghost of the undisclosed bourne from which no traveler returns. Now, of course, what he may mean is returns alive, and that would, of course, sort of rationalize a sense of discrepancy in the plot one might have. But at the same time, the tenor of the whole speech is sort of compared with the usual it's hard to use this word of anyone as brilliant as Hamlet, but I'm tempted to say orthodoxy of Hamlet's religious outlook is a striking disparity, and which reflects the instability I have in mind in the play in general. Of course, the attitude toward revenge. At times, it's a cursed spite that he was born to set it right. At other times, he wants to be more bloodthirsty than an actor who has no reason to care about anything at all, and so there's this obvious wavering in his attitude toward revenge. Certainly, one could conclude that he feels in a way victimized by the importunity of the ghost, who is, after all, his father, and that there are other times when he feels that it's perfectly appropriate to fit into this paradigm. In itself, although it has been an enormous and undying topic in Hamlet criticism, I don't know that I find that as interesting as the whole question of what's happening in Shakespeare's mind to feudal culture. It's, of course, partly a question of the code and bearing of his father and the obvious sort of sense of the fitness of things according to which his father lived, which is certainly old school, and something that a young scholar from Wittenberg, or for that matter, a young scholar having a good time in Paris, might not spontaneously buy into. But that in itself, it seems to me, isn't the whole story. It seems to me that Shakespeare is preoccupied with a new way of being in the world in this play, which has to do with the addiction to homiletic advice, particularly of the Polonius family. The Polonii. I mean, obviously, Polonius to Laertes and to Ophelia, Laertes to Ophelia, and frankly, it's infectious, because we even find Hamlet giving advice. He's just, on and on, telling the players their business. I mean, everybody in the play is infected by this instinct to indulge in homiletic advice, which I take no doubt anachronistically, to be a bourgeois characteristic. In other words, it seems to me that it has to do with the Polonius and Laertes' sense of the unfitness of Ophelia to be Hamlet's wife. Gertrude says in the long run that she'd have been perfectly happy to see Hamlet marry Ophelia, but the family doesn't think this is appropriate at all, which makes me think they may be the sorts of persons elevated in station originally by Henry VIII and who represent a new, what would have been called in the Napoleonic period, carrière ouverte au talent, an opening, in other words, of the possibility of persons not of nobility to preferment. And I see this as something percolating in the play and an aspect of what I take to be an instability of intellectual framework. And then finally, just sort of the problem of Hamlet beginning our exposure to him by saying, pulling himself up to his full height and saying, "I know not seems, madam, I know not seems." And then for the rest of the play, engulfed in performance, the play of appearances, mirroring, the undermining of the difference between appearance and reality, and coming to the point where he says things like, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." In other words, the person who is so absolute as to think that he knows not seems is at the same time, and this is the flavor of his character that perhaps we most come away with, a relativist, a person who recognizes that in a certain sense the beliefs one holds are arbitrary. And I think that too is a tension well worth exploring. Now, I've gone on far longer than I meant to. I'll shut up. We don't have opening discourses by all of us in mind, but I hope that people will just sort of pipe up.
I'd like to jump on something you said about Shakespeare giving advice. I mean, Hamlet giving advice, because I do think it's Shakespeare giving advice. When he says, "Speak the speech, I pray thee, as I pronounced it to you." He should have said, "as I wrote it for you," because actually what he's doing is criticizing actors who extrapolate and improvise on his lines. And it's a good opportunity for the playwright to get a little of his own back. And I'd like to extend that to the point of saying, with trepidation, that Hamlet's imagination is Shakespeare's imagination, and that there is really something inseparable between the playwright and his creation. And I know this is it's a very controversial thing to say in this day and age, because critics are now divided into classicists and romantics on this subject, starting with T.S. Eliot, who felt that the greatest playwrights and greatest writers were essentially very impersonal and let none of their personal lives get into their work. He was one to talk, of course, since you can tell almost everything about Eliot from his work. And today, of course, Jim Shapiro, who I admire enormously, takes the same position, and so does Ron Rosenbaum. Whereas Steve Greenblatt has stimulated a lot of controversy in Will in the World by suggesting that Shakespeare was virtually inseparable from his plays. And I agree with Steve. I think you can find Shakespeare anywhere in his plays. I think that he's a very subjective playwright. I think if you look at his sonnets, for example, which are essentially lyrical, and as we know, lyrical work is the poet speaking. Epic work, we're told, is the poet speaking and to other characters, and dramatic work, we're told, is characters speaking to each other. But nevertheless, I always think there's the touch of the lyric in what Shakespeare writes, and that the greatest thing that's been written on this play, to my way of thinking, is an essay that is often dismissed, and it's that brilliant Scylla and Charybdis section from Ulysses, the library section, in which Stephen Dedalus, who should know because Stephen Dedalus is a mouthpiece for James Joyce, says in effect that Hamlet, not Hamlet, but Hamlet's father, the ghost, is a mouthpiece for William Shakespeare. And that Shakespeare was cuckolded by Gertrude, by Anne Hathaway, as Hamlet was cuckolded by Gertrude. There is a connection between Hamlet and Hamnet, the young son, the 11-year-old boy who died very soon before this play was written. And we see also traces of what I think to be Shakespeare's own misogyny in the way that Hamlet treats Ophelia, and the way he treats Gertrude, and the way he speaks about women in his sonnets, and the way Othello speaks about Desdemona, and Leontes speaks about Hermione. You just go through his plays, even where it's not justified, the power of the misogyny is such that you feel that the playwright is extra dramatically speaking beyond the nature of the need of the work. He's part of a tradition here, by the way. He's not writing alone. He's writing with a covey of playwrights who include John Marston, Ben Jonson, John Webster, John Ford, Beaumont and Fletcher. And they're all of them writing in a tradition of a convention called the Italianate Court Convention. This play belongs to the Italianate Court Convention. And in that convention, there is a reflection of a corrupt court, which is full of adulterous women, full of poisonings, full of effeminacy, not gayness, by the way. It's distinguished from gayness. It's effeminacy on the part of many courtiers. In this case, Osric is a perfect example. And it's full of dissembling, where people behave in a way that they don't believe. And of course, that Hamlet should be one of the first prime examples of dissemblers in this. Shows you that Shakespeare has some ambiguity about this character, which we share. We certainly share it when we see him brutalizing Ophelia. So what I'm trying to say is that if you go through Shakespeare's plays, and if you go through Hamlet in particular, you will definitely see analogies between Shakespeare's life, Shakespeare's opinions, Shakespeare's attitudes, and the attitudes of this particular play. So Shakespeare is, in a sense, writing himself, and the imagination of Hamlet is the imagination of William Shakespeare.
Bob, do you think that's true of all writers, or is it just particularly true of Shakespeare?
I think it's true of all writers to some extent. It's true of some writers to a great extent. The Romantics, of course, wrote themselves, and were very happy to admit they wrote themselves. Shelley and Byron and Wordsworth and what have you. Whereas the impersonal writers, and Eliot mentions Middleton, for example, as a perfect example of an impersonal writer. But if you go through Middleton's plays, particularly The Changeling, you can extrapolate certain attitudes there, which he shares in common with his fellow playwrights. What happens, by the way, is in 1599 there was a bishop's edict which banned satire, banned poetic satire, which was being written by John Marston, by Nash, by Ben Jonson, and suddenly they were no longer allowed to write this kind of satire, which were attacks on the court, attacks on women, attacks on effeminacy, attacks on too much peace being, in a sense, interesting idea they had about peace and about war, which was that if, through the humanist theory, that if you did not shed blood in war, you built it up in your body and it became semen. And it had to be expressed some other way through adulterous relations with court ladies. And that was a form of effeminacy, you see, too much sexual action with the ladies. And that is something that Shakespeare makes allusion to in a number of his plays, and so do all these other plays. So here was the bishop's edict. So all these guys then went into the theater. Marston began writing plays. He wasn't very good at it for a while, but he got better and better, and he wrote The Malcontent and Antonio's Revenge, and a number of revenge plays. And he started a tradition that was followed by Shakespeare in Hamlet of writing this Italianate court play. I say Italianate because they're generally set in Italy, even though this one is set in Denmark. Italy being the home of Machiavelli, being the home of Castiglione, who taught everybody manners.
Murder of Gonzago.
The Murder of Gonzago, exactly. That is an Italianate court play. That's the one Italianate court play he wrote, which is the play within the play in Hamlet. What they're doing is trying to reflect the English court without being punished for it. And that feeling about the English court grows and grows until James I, taking over from Elizabeth after her death, creates the kind of court which is really the creation of a fevered imagination of the playwrights, where in effect his court is justifying and realizing the Italianate court as it was conceived by these playwrights. I've gone on much too long, so I'll stop for a
Well,
minute.
I might jump with a thought about the Shakespeare's imagination and Hamlet's imagination. Essays on Hamlet. It's a very old essay by Maynard Mack that was published in the 50s, I think. It's called The World of Hamlet. And he says in that essay that Hamlet is a play that's written in the interrogative mood, and that it's basically posing a set of questions. And I was very struck when Paul was writing to us about the Roundtable, how many questions there were in your emails. It was that same set of
Complete sentences,
all
though.
of these, all the complete sentences. But Mack makes a list that's more than a page long of all the unanswered questions in the play. And listening to you, it made me think: are we seeing not just a homology between Shakespeare's imagination and Hamlet's, but this kind of interrogative, questioning, exploring mind that's putting things together in a way that it seems to me what's really interesting about Hamlet is many of the questions really aren't answered. For instance, one of the really important questions is, what did Gertrude know, right? Is Gertrude guilty? And these questions are really not answered. And when you think about Hamlet, it seems to me that there's sort of two ways of thinking, or at least many. Hamlet is in some ways like a kind of mad interpreter. He finds all these details that justify his theory, and he's always trying to bring them all together. And in a way, there's a kind of paranoia, which I sometimes feel is embodied by the castle itself. Can you get out of the castle? And when you finally get out of the castle for a little while, everything changes. It's great. But for most of the time, you're kind of deep in this poisoned, really poisoned inner castle that you can. That's, I think, as you said, the court world itself, right? This poisoned place. And in that place, there's a kind of paranoid imagination where everything is sort of feeding. But at the same time, there are all these clues that don't fit. And so there's another interpreter who could be there, and I don't know if that's the imagination of Shakespeare, saying, but there's a whole other set of ways to understand these things. So I wonder what you think about that sense that there's a kind of Gothic, murky, interrogative, questioning quality to a lot of the play. I was sort of curious of whether that rings any bells for you, that sense of this sort of set of unanswered questions, and can you find a space where you really feel sure you have the answers? The play's the thing. I mean, when you were thinking through it, did you have moments where earlier in the play it was more uncertain, and then moments where there were
absolutely. I mean, this play,
turning point, decision? This
play is like a derivative. I mean, you could explain it away, and I still don't quite understand it. You know, I mean, it's just sort of limitless, bottomless. And I think what's interesting about what you said about, you know, it being Shakespeare's imagination, I think that's what the playwright was so brilliant at doing, was sharing an imagination that we all can lose ourselves in, and so that it merges his with us. And at a point, you have to drop everything else and go into yourself as a player doing this. And so these questions became so insurmountable that I began to answer them for myself as if I were Hamlet answering these questions. Whether they were right or not didn't matter.
You had to make a decision.
I had to make a decision,
right.
And I had to make a decision up to a point, and then you realize it's useless. And the main point that I found at the end of the play was that his imagination sort of got so out of control that he had to die before he died. And I think that's really, I feel that's where this, fall of a sparrow and that whole state becomes, that he's
So
he's
you
died.
think the famous calm of the fifth act is like a posthumousness?
I don't think it's calm. I mean, he fights like a mother.
I would argue that.
I mean, he really goes all through. He goes as hard as he can, until there is no more.
I don't know if this makes sense to you, but it seemed to me that in parts of Act 5, he almost simply says, I'm going to go with it.
Yeah.
He says something like, I've been in continual practice, I'll win at the odds. And there's sort of a sense of, I'm like a stream, I'm going to jump into it and it's going to drive me along and I'm going to push as hard as I can in it.
Yeah.
And whatever comes, it'll happen, sort of. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. And like it was said earlier, very different from it seems, Madam. He's got this real strong journey in this play where he relinquishes that first scene.
I come at it from a slightly different angle in terms of the imagination of Shakespeare, the imagination of Hamlet. The question on the table for me is something like, how does Shakespeare create the illusion that Hamlet has his own imagination, that he's a free agent of the self, as Hegel said, that he can almost speak his own lines, make them up as he goes along? How is this kind of an illusion created? It seems to me that it takes a superior kind of artistry to pull that off, where the illusion itself is so supreme that we do imagine that Hamlet could go whatever way he wanted to go with. He doesn't have to follow the text of Shakespeare. He could invent himself as he goes along. He can overhear himself, as it's been said, and change course. And I don't think we can ever answer that mystery. But one of the ways that I've come at it is to look into the parapraxes that Shakespeare has planted in the mouth of Hamlet, and I've found about 26 or 27 parapraxes throughout the various plays. There are 5 in Hamlet. And I'm only going to...
What's a paraprax?
A parapraxis is a slip of the tongue, a mistake that seems like a mistake, but that really isn't. It's a mistake, I think, that shows you that consciousness is not the sole executor of the human mind, but that unconsciousness can step in and run the show. And the first example of a mistake that Hamlet makes is in the first soliloquy. And I'd love to bring that to your attention. It's the famous soliloquy which begins, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. O God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it, fie. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. But 2 months dead. Nay, not so much, not 2. Now that's a slip, and it's easy to miss it. Hamlet says, my father's 2 months dead, and then corrects himself, saying, no, it's not that long, it's only 1 month. And I think the question on the table, if you look at that, is, what is Shakespeare up to there? Planting this pseudo-mistake, if you like, in the mouth of Hamlet. If you want to get very Freudian about it, you could say, well, Hamlet is ruminating on the death of his father a month before the father actually dies. Is that doesn't an Oedipal interpretation rushes into you? And if that disturbs your sensibility, we can say, well, he's also ruminating about 1 and 2. He's confusing two-ness and oneness. And we can ask, I think, about the psychology of that. Is Hamlet saying, I wish I could be the way I was at the beginning of time when mother and child were 2 and 1. 1 and 2 didn't have to be differentiated from each other. In fact, from a child developmental point of view, the differentiation only takes place really in the second year of life. It's when the child develops enough memory and enough language that the child who was kind of symbiotic prior to that suddenly realizes, I am a separate, solitary individual responsible for my own thinking and my own ideas. And that causes, as you know, the great separation anxiety that's been written about so much. And more than that, I think it causes a lot of the existential angst that we all feel throughout life about being separate, solitary creatures. So I'm only suggesting that the parapraxis there is packed with psychology if we dare to look into it a bit. Even more intriguing, if I can go on a little bit longer, is that Shakespeare reprises this parapraxis, this mistake, in Act 3, Scene 2. He reprises it delightfully. It is the moment where Hamlet has set up the idea that he'll put on the play to catch the conscience of the king. You remember all the courtiers are there, everybody's there. The mood is kind of manic. His mother says, "Sit beside me." And Hamlet said, "Oh, here's metal more attractive." And he moves over towards Ophelia. And he starts teasing her with sexual innuendos. He's going to lie in her lap. He's talking about the nothing between her legs. And she says, "You're merry, my lord." And he says, "Me merry? No, look how merry my mother looks. And my father's dead within 2 hours." And she says, Ophelia, falling into the trap, really, "Nay, 'tis twice 2 months, my lord." And Hamlet pounces now with bitterness and says, "Oh, heavens, died 2 months ago and not forgotten yet?" What's amazing about that for me is that Shakespeare has reprised the first parapraxis, replayed it. It's as if the first one might have been unconscious, but this second one is surely contrived. Hamlet knows precisely what he's doing, and he sets up Ophelia for this amazing piece of sarcasm that comes out of his mouth. James Joyce says, "The man of genius makes no mistakes."
His errors are volitional.
His errors are volitional.
Are the portals of discovery.
And are the portals of discovery. And he's talking about Shakespeare when he writes that in Ulysses. But I think we could say these parapraxes, throwaway as they seem, are portals of discovery if you're willing to peer into them a bit and extract what's in there.
But if Hamlet's father were Jewish, it would be quite natural for him to marry, for her to marry his brother immediately.
And would it be okay for Hamlet to think about his death a month before it actually happens?
Probably not. He'd be thinking about his bar mitzvah, probably.
As devil's advocate for the man as to the claim that the man of genius makes no mistakes, and I'm a romanticist and a believer. I believe in Coleridge, and of course Coleridge too thinks the man of genius makes no mistakes. I just though as a test, the moment, and this is for Christian as well, because I'd love to know how you performed it and what you thought about it when you got to it. In the fifth act, at the moment when Hamlet apologizes to Laertes, he plays the madness card. And it seems to me to be completely flat, unimaginative, and in a way caddish. Yes, it's true. He can't be blamed as a direct willing agent either for the death of Polonius or the madness and death of Ophelia. But at the same time, to plead madness as his excuse in all apparent sincerity, when throughout the play he's been insisting to everyone that he's only mad north-northwest and he knows a hawk from a handsaw, seems to me, as I say, crude, because it's letting himself off too easily and playing a card that he hasn't thought it necessary to play before, and that seems to me, just for that interval of apology to Laertes, to simplify things. And so I'd love to hear someone show, how can I put it, the genius of that.
How does he justify saying that he loved Ophelia so much more than Laertes when he's shown nothing but abuse for her throughout the play?
Yeah. I loved you once, he says early. And then, of course, later in confrontation with Laertes, he says, and then I loved you not. Yeah. And then I loved Ophelia.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know whether we can also add another question to Christian, because I thought a lot about this question about why does he say, I loved you, and outdo his brother. And one of the things I've thought about it, and I don't know whether this was at all something you thought of, but that when Ophelia is alive, she presents this scary, threatening possibility. The young woman who could be fertile in this way. Gertrude's sexuality is much more grotesque, but she's past the childbearing age we imagine. But Ophelia is the young, fertile woman who you love, but is also threatening because she's alive. She could cuckold you. She could be a whore, a prostitute. And he can't even say that, so he says, "Get thee to a nunnery," with that pun. Is it really prostitution, or is it that you really are pure, right? But he becomes so overwhelmed by this sexual disgust. When she dies, he's somehow that the real love can flow back into him, because the anxiety, the threat that she might represent, in the way I think about it, is gone. So there really is a connection between the death, the fact that she's dead, and his capacity to recover his memory, his love, to really feel it again. Whereas he loses that to some degree in those abusive scenes. And I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I sort of wondered about, is that why he can say to Laertes, "I love her so much more than you do," and leap into the grave and grab her body, because that body isn't threatening now. So it's a very scary and chilly sense that he can only love when her threat is, in a sense, gone, and that means death in this play. So I don't know if you that rings any bells with you when you were doing it.
It rings a little bit of bells. I mean, the thing about doing and thinking, and when you have to approach a play and actually play it, the underneath, you can't really play that hard. You're playing what someone who's not aware of what's underneath is happening is playing.
Right.
And so in a way, that's where the path was going. I chose that there was a deep connection between him and Ophelia. I chose to think, and it's nowhere does it really say, but that he truly does love her. Right. He truly does throughout. And that he does go. When I was working on this play, I would go on the subway and I'd see people, there was crazy people talking out loud to themselves, and then there was us talking to ourselves, sort of down here, and then there was people just thinking, and you could tell that they were talking to themselves, thinking. The line between madness and sanity is so thin in our world. We think it's much extreme, but it's not.
Right.
And so I felt that, there was also the issue of, where Ophelia says, "I must wear mine with a difference," and what does that mean? Is she pregnant? Because that herb, when you wear it around a certain part of your body, means you're pregnant. Which brought up a whole nother sort of, now are they more intimate than we've seen on the page?
Right.
If so, if she is indeed holding a child, just go with the fantasy, then it's much more important that she get the hell out of there. Mm-hmm. She leave, and she would not go if she wasn't convinced that this was a maniac. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, that's what I was going. And he pushes himself with this, with this mantra that I'm going to pretend I'm going to be crazy. And I think the misogyny kicks in at a certain point. There is a bit of an insanity going on. It goes too far, I think. At least we played it in that way, where it starts off on one thing and it just gets pushed way over.
Did anyone see Bergman's production of this, by the way?
No, I didn't see it. I tried not to see anything.
That was the most brutal production of Hamlet ever. I've forgotten the name of the Swedish actor. He's a brilliant Swedish actor who was in, you don't know his name. Anyway, Ophelia was handing out, instead of flowers, she was handing out rusty nails.
Wow.
Claudius was taking Gertrude in full view of the court from behind. On stage.
Wow.
At the very end, when Fortinbras comes in, it says, go bid my soldiers shoot." He shoots everybody in the court, including Horatio and everyone else who's left. And they come in with jackboots, and it's the future of fascism, future of totalitarianism.
Oh, I got to see it.
It was an extraordinary production from that point of view, and the cruelty of Hamlet, the brutality of Hamlet was very powerfully. You played the anti-Hamlet as well. You played Orlando in As You Like It, which in a way is an anti-Hamlet, because he comes to the country away from the court, where everything is presumably pure. We get those wonderful speeches from Duke Sr. about the purity of the country as opposed to the court. And instead of his dominating and brutalizing a woman, he's being led by a woman and being taught by a woman and instructed by a woman, namely Rosalind. I think
it might be worth just to add one more thing about the As You Like It, just given your experience. I wanted to just be sure this was in the mix, that the same year that Hamlet was being written, he's also writing Twelfth Night. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to think about those two plays as having an interesting mirror relationship. And they're both, in a way, about somebody who wants to mourn too long, and people around them are saying, oh, cheer up, you don't need to be mourning. And in one play, Hamlet, he's right that people haven't mourned enough. And in the other play, there's this, it's almost as if Shakespeare sort of says, okay, I want to reprise this thing, but I want to redo it. It's got a lot of melancholy. It's got a lot of similar issues, but I'm going to redo it. I'm going to rethink it. And it's almost, to me, this is where I wonder again about the imagination. I often think about him as writing those two plays in a kind of dueling banjos way. So now I'll try the court scene where the brooding, melancholic person, or the Jaques person isn't the right, is absolutely in the right, is in the moral position. Now I'll write one with, no, that's a little wrong. And so I sometimes think just making the imagination congruent with one play leaves out this sense that the plays talk to each other, just like you were saying.
I picked that up in terms of, and I wonder if this is a place to bring it in, but I'll bring it in anyway. In terms of your mentioning the grieving and the mourning in both of the plays, whether it's worth thinking about what was the effect of the death of Hamlet in 1596 on the imagination of Shakespeare 3 or 4 years later when he wrote Hamlet, Twelfth Night, as you say, and also the Phoenix and Turtle. They're all around that time, and they're all ruminations, I think, about grief and loss. Joyce felt this way, as you know, in Ulysses. But Joyce, as far as I know, didn't examine the text of Hamlet as closely as it can be examined. If you examine it very closely, in terms of the death of the twin, the play is full of twinnings of all sorts.
Yeah.
All the characters seem to move around in twins. There's Marcellus and Bernardo at the beginning. There's Cornelius and Valtimand for a very brief
and
time.
Hendiadys itself is.
Hendiadys.
And there's so much of it.
I was just about to get to Hendiadys because there are 66 examples of Hendiadys in Hamlet, more than in any other play that Shakespeare wrote. Hendiadys, in case you don't know, is from Greek hen diadys. 2 through 1. In other words, you have two ideas that are meant to express one complex idea. The play is full of that. Hamlet is the perfume and suppliance of an hour. You remember that one.
Slings and arrows.
Slings and arrows, rank and gross. Frank Kermode says there are so many of these Hendiadys scattered throughout the play that it's kind of a dizzying effect on you. It's all sound and fury, rank and gross, slings and arrows. There's a play within a play, as you know, another kind of twinning. There's a dumb show within the play within a play. But to me, the most haunting one of all maybe is in Act 5, Scene 1, that really begins to mention twins, I think, where Gertrude, the lines are usually cut out of the play, and I think I said it to Paul, I feel like screaming, don't cut those lines out, those are very significant. But the lines are, Hamlet and Laertes have jumped into the grave. Again, a kind of enactment, if you like, of 2 in 1. And Gertrude is worried about the craziness of her son. And she says, oh, well, this is mere madness, and thus a while the fit will work on him. Anon, as patient as the female dove, when that her golden couplets are disclosed, his silence will sit drooping. I mean, if you listen to what's being said there, she's saying, he's wild and mad now, but if only his twins could be returned to him, like the dove with the golden couplets, he'd be fine. And it's hard not to see Shakespeare there, it seems to me, saying to himself, if my twin could be returned to me, maybe this wild grief that I'm in would calm down. And I think that there is grief in the Twelfth Night, as you say, of a similar kind with twins.
Yeah. He didn't treat the surviving twin very well, though,
yeah.
Judith, because he gave all his money to Susanne, who presumably was his legitimate child in my.
But how could it not be that the death of Hamlet had some influence on him? The death of an 11-year-old boy?
Well, of course, it had an enormous influence on him. But why didn't he transfer his love to the twin, to Judith, who, as you know, was betrothed to a man who was 4 years younger than she was, as Shakespeare was betrothed to a woman 8 years older than he was, and he married her because he impregnated her with Susanne. And you can imagine the kind of resentment that would have come out of that.
I would say grief has a lot of anger in it. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's why he wasn't able to. You're suggesting something very rational and decent, right? That he would love the surviving twin.
I'm suggesting that maybe he transferred some of his resentment towards Anne to Judith. And
Virginia Woolf calls Shakespeare's sister Judith mopping and mowing in a crossroads. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if this could get us back to the question of misogyny.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that since you mentioned it. You had this great phrase, sort of more misogyny than he needs, an excess of misogyny. And I was thinking about Suzanne's point about the plays in dialogue with each other. I've just come from thinking a lot about Winter's Tale, which is has a dead child in it who never comes back, and it's at the end of his career. And at the beginning of Winter's Tale, both Leontes and Polixenes have these almost embarrassingly misogynistic moments about what it was like to be twin lambs together before there was difference, either from each other or from women. And as the first act proceeds, Leontes becomes more and more hysterical in his anxieties about what it would mean to lack difference now. And it seems to me, at least in that play, the anxieties are so overblown and over the top that they're there for us to anatomize. They're not Shakespeare simply sort of advocating that kind of misogyny. They're Shakespeare holding it up as a mirror to nature, maybe. And I'm not so sure. I mean, one of the things about Hamlet that seems to me so tense and interesting is the way it's on the cusp of different kinds of anxieties. When Hamlet says, I have that within which passes show, then that's an anti-theatrical Hamlet. That's a Hamlet who disdains the shows of the period. But when he says, I'll catch the conscience of the king, that's Hamlet is sort of anticipating the major defense of theater in the period, which is that it's an instrument of knowledge. It's good for finding out criminals in the audience. So it feels to me at a crossroads, very dense with ambivalence or contradiction or interrogation rather than just... I mean, I've been on that comment for a while just because it's such a interestingly provocative way into the play.
Everything in Act 2 and 3 is espionage. I mean, it's just all...
Yeah. Everybody's doing the same thing. They're just doing it better or worse. But.
Yeah.
Can I come back to the 2 months question? I don't know if you have some thoughts on that. I just have been meditating on all the things you said since you said them. And I guess that the 2-in-1 part, I don't understand and see as clearly as I do the question about timing. And I'm not sure, you've now brought in yet more 2-in-1 ideas. And I don't know, for me, I think twinning may be more about mirroring and doubles than it is about two becoming one. So the 2-in-1 we could maybe come back to, but I wanted to talk about timing a little bit because something seems really right to me based on this play, based on the plot, that there is a haziness about timing. I mean, you could say one of those unanswered questions is exactly how long ago did Hamlet's father die, right? But the reason it seems to me interesting in relation to the plot is when did the affair between Gertrude and Claudius begin? Did it actually begin before the death or not? That's one of the big things you don't know. And it seems to me that sense that his mind might be, his imagination might be roving without his realizing it, to the idea that some of this corruption actually might have preceded the death. It's not just about hasty marriage, but rather that there was something going on. Before he sees the ghost and knows the story, this sort of roving sense of, maybe it was longer, maybe it was shorter, right? So something seems really right about that slip of the tongue to me, that for him, that's where underneath his mind is pushing and sort of digging at what's happening around him. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but timing-wise, those issues seem really something the audience, we're meant to be drawn into that puzzlement, it seems to me. So right. I don't know if that...
I agree. I think how Shakespeare creates that illusion that so much is going on, and that he does it through the use of a throwaway kind of parapraxis. I agree with what you're saying, that there's that suggestion that maybe the affair was going on for a long time before it is.
I think, to contradict myself, that if it isn't in the play, it's not there. The actor has to have it. The actor has to make some jump, has to make some leap. But if Shakespeare didn't write it, it's not there.
Didn't write what?
Whether that Gertrude was having an affair
That we don't
with
know.
Claudius.
Right.
Well,
It wasn't important
But
to him.
Suzanne's talking earlier about questions, and there's the question, quite apart from whether the affair had been long-standing, whether she knows about the murder, whether she, there are all sorts of ways, frustrating ways in which we're in the dark.
We have the same problem about Lady Macbeth's children. I mean, she ripped a child from her breast, but he has no children. Where are Lady Macbeth's children? And as what's his name once told us, how many children had Lady Macbeth? It's completely irrelevant if it's not in the play. That actors again have to make sense, have to know what a character wants.
But if genius makes no mistakes,
he's not making a mistake.
It's not a mistake.
Because what's not there is on purpose. Because what's not there is for us as the audience. And for what I found very helpful was that the audience for these soliloquies and for the whole play, for Hamlet, as far as I was concerned, was his imagination, was his mind. That the audience itself were different parts. And as an actor, it was very helpful, because if someone was bored, that's part of his brain. If someone was interested, that's part of him. It was very easy to play with. But in this particular instance, the audience doesn't know, nor does Hamlet.
Right.
So we're sharing that experience together. And I think that was and that's the genius, I think, of Shakespeare keeping that information out.
Right.
And that's why he doesn't really lend himself to psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Because it's not a real person; it's an imagined person, and we're not provided with all of the elements, the machinery of the mind and of the psyche that we would be with a real person lying down on a couch with a psychoanalyst.
But your whole concept is that you and Stephen Greenblatt have this enormous connection between the imagination of Shakespeare and the imagination of Hamlet.
Well, I think Shakespeare can lie down on a couch, but some of his characters can't, are not meant to. That what we know about them is what we know about them.
What are you going to do with the slip of the tongue, then? It's an ambiguous...
Well, is it really a slip of the tongue?
illusion.
I don't know if I completely buy that. I mean,
What is it, then?
he's saying that
It's 1 month and 28 days.
My father's been dead for 2 months. Not so much, not 2. Maybe it's 1.5. Maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's 1 3/4. Maybe he feels he's exaggerating, wants to be more precise.
And Ophelia thinks she can say it's longer than that, and presumably without any sort of conscious prevarication.
Yeah, he's being provocative there.
Yeah, and she overreacts perhaps, but still, she names an even longer period of time.
It's confusing me a little bit. Whose slip of the tongue do you think it is?
Me?
Yes.
It's Hamlet's slip of the tongue.
So,
But
you were
Shakespeare
saying
has...
that Shakespeare purposely...
Without doubt. This is supreme artistry, right? I must say, the first time I noticed that slip of the
So
tongue...
in that case, why do you connect it to anything having to do with the mother rather than having to do with the twins?
I mean, I connect it to the twins. I do connect it to the notion that he's thinking about his father's death prior to the 1 month. So there's something in his mind about his own parasital instincts, it seems to me.
But the Oedipal part I understood, but you also made another connection having to do with mother-child, 2 in 1.
Oh, why do I do that piece?
Yeah.
Only because there's some... I mean, to me, if you imagine that Hamlet would like to get out of the misery of his mind, away from his Oedipal guilt and all the torment that's going on inside his mind, the 2 in 1 to me would be a kind of a regressive movement back to when he was a child and he was in his mother's arms, and two-ness and oneness didn't have to be differentiated. It's in that sense that I bring it in, drag it in, you might say, but that's the way I was coming at that.
In The Murder of Gonzago, I think it's always interesting that the Lucianus, or Luciano, is it? Is the nephew.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Which jumbles in a very interesting way the generations, just as Stephen in Scylla and Charybdis has so much fun jumbling the generations. What is the ultimate punchline? Hamlet was his own grandfather. And that, it seems to me, brings the complexity of the incest motif into view, because yes, it's Hamlet Gertrude, but it's also Claudius Gertrude, and it's also various other permutations and computations that can come into view. Yeah.
We haven't worked on that yet.
But it seems to me that I mean, just in response to Ed's question, that too would be a way to sort of talk about modulating from the specifically Oedipal issue to the child development issue, in which the 2-in-1 topic emerges, that there is a kind of continuity between the two of them. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
I would, and apropos of your point about Claudius Hamlet, there is that slip later on in the play where Hamlet addresses Claudius as my mother. You remember that?
Is that a slip or is
Well,
that
he's farewell, my mother, and then Claudius says, my father.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying farewell to you. I mean, that's the way I read it, but you could be right.
No, but I mean, it's a contrived slip, I think, where again, he's setting Claudius up. He's saying, my mother. And
He says man and wife are one flesh.
Right.
He goes on to explain it.
He does. He
Right.
well, because Claudius counters saying, thy loving father, Hamlet. And then Hamlet explains his logic, that man and wife are one flesh, and therefore fathers and mothers are the same thing. Just apropos of your point, I think there is that there as well.
I think this, though, goes very much to your question of how does he create somebody that we think is a person, that so many people fall into the sort of deep conviction as a person, and I think it's because of the number, at least partly because of the number of devices which we think of as making up personality. You were talking about Lucianus being a nephew. I think one of the remarkable things through both the Pyrrhus speech and the play within the play is the sense of overdetermination, the way that at one moment Pyrrhus is Claudius about to kill the good king, and another moment he's Hamlet with a sword paralyzed and unable to move, and another moment he's even maybe Hamlet the elder having his ear cleft, and the way that the text sort of slides around between identifications makes it what we think of as personality in many ways. So it's
How old is Hamlet?
That's one of those questions there are several answers to. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And the reason there are several answers is he has many ages in the play.
He's got
Shakespeare has not fixed an age on him. And quite often does not fix consistency on his characters, which I think makes them a little elusive for psychoanalysis.
What have you got against psychoanalysis, Bob?
Personally, from my point of view of psychoanalysis, that you can psychoanalyze Hamlet or you can psychoanalyze Shakespeare. You can use the play to explain and describe things if you are teaching about psychoanalysis, as you would use the example of a patient if you are using trying to explain psychoanalysis. Well, I don't think you can psychoanalyze either of them, and I'm not so sure I would go along with this idea of the slip of the tongue either, because if it is the slip of the tongue that Shakespeare puts on purpose for Hamlet, he would have to have such genius much earlier than Freud that he already gives meaning to slips of tongue. And if it is not...
I'm not sure that...
we should hear this.
Go ahead. And if it is not, then is it Shakespeare's mistake? Or is it just on purpose? That's something he's trying to communicate.
But I have no trouble at all with the idea that Shakespeare anticipates Freud by 300 years.
That's right.
No, you can say that what you find in Shakespeare can be later understood in Freudian terms. But there is no evidence to say that Shakespeare knew that slips of the tongue have specific unconscious meaning, and that meaning refers to Oedipal conflict and early mother-child relationship. I can't imagine that.
But Ed, unconsciously, people always know that when someone makes a slip of the tongue, there's something weird going on. I mean, it's naturalism.
Weird going on is something else.
I mean, that there's something happening. Like, say, if I refer to you as if I referred to you as somebody else. I mean, even if we didn't know about Freud, wouldn't there be some element in which you would say people would just, people
It's very hard to say that today because
so, yeah.
we are enmeshed in Freudian. In my own example, prior to knowing anything about Freud, I didn't think twice about slips of the tongue.
Wordsworth makes his reader indulge in slips of the tongue. In the Intimations Ode, remember the line, "The winds come to us from the fields of sleep." Well, it's a pastoral poem, and it's almost impossible not to say the winds come to us from the fields of sheep. And there are, there are recurrent moments of that kind in which the poet is forcing parapraxis on the reader. And I would say that in a way, arguably, that's what Shakespeare, or Hamlet, if you will, is doing in that first act. I don't know whether.
But I just have to disagree with your point of view, and I've been trying to articulate what it is. It seems to me there's several steps, and this is related to what Paul just said. There's an attempt to create the illusion of a complex psychological life. There's no particular specific Freudian content that Shakespeare is trying to put into that life, but he's giving the feeling of a living, thinking person who has these kinds of experiences. Secondly, he's really interested in the problems of mourning and grief. And in his own time, with a different language than you would use, he's meditating on what is melancholy. Melancholy was a court fashion at the time. Right. He's meditating on mourning and what is proper mourning and what isn't. He probably is thinking about the limitation in Protestant culture on the traditional mourning rituals. So there's all this stuff that's culturally coherent for his time. That's his set of languages about mourning and whether you might be mourning in advance, what the timing of it is. All those issues are knit together. And so I don't think you have to have a kind of intentionalist notion that Shakespeare was thinking about notions of Freudian theories of slip of the tongue to see that slip of the tongue as being a very good mimesis of a complex cultural and psychological experience that we might then add a different language to. But it's a very similar set of perceptions about the human imagination, just a different language that we would talk about it. So what we do when we think about interpretations, we bring those things together. And it seems to me, in a way, that's sort of what the actor does, because the actor thinks of your own set of issues about timing and mourning and those issues, and you bring that together with the text version of it, and you try to think about it. So I guess I'm pretty anti-intentionalist anyway. I basically, I'm not sure we know what Shakespeare really thought about a lot of things. So, but I don't think we should close the door to the extent that you're closing it to rule out the kind of speculation that your thoughts are raising. Doesn't mean I necessarily am convinced by all your theories, but I think it's right to see that as a speculative sort of moment in Hamlet where we're asked to think about these issues.
What do you do with a character like Leontes, though, who is obviously almost psychotic in the first act of that Winter's Tale, and he sees his best friend, who he's asked to take care of his wife,
smile,
paddling on her hand, and immediately he goes apeshit over this. And nevertheless, by the fifth act, the fourth and fifth act, he's completely cured. Has he cured himself? Has he been to a therapist? How did
16 years of
16
therapy.
years.
He says Paulina conjured up his evils from memory. It's a talking cure. That's what they've been doing for 16 years.
It was a long time, 16 years to be fair. I have one thing I wanted to ask. That's a very different thing. If we have a minute to turn the conversation in a slightly different way, this is something I've often thought of, and I really wanted to see what Bob thought about it, what you thought about it in sort of the theatrical world. But when I think of a play very different from Hamlet, like Beckett's Endgame, I think about a place where the stage is the mind, and where the windows are like eyes trying to look out and not seeing anything maybe. But that sense that the whole stage is the head is somehow the way I've always responded to that play. And I was thinking about the topic of Shakespeare's imagination, and I was thinking about the court and the fact that so much of the play we're stuck in the court and we can't escape it is kind of like the mind of the play. And I looked up a couple of lines that I've always been struck by. One of them is Hamlet's line early on when he's talking about the drinking, and he says. This is the passage where he talks about more honored in the breach than the observance. And he talks about when we have one fault, sometimes that overwhelms and makes people think negatively about us. And he says, so oft it chances in particular men that for some vicious mole of nature in them, as in their birth, wherein they are not guilty, since nature cannot choose his origin, but by the o'ergrowth of some complexion, oft breaking down the pales and forts of reason. And so the image of reason there is a fort, a boundary, a pale. And you're in this space of reason. And I often think that the court is like this sort of figure of the mind. And then when he sees the ghost, the ghost says, he waves me on. And he goes out to the edge of the ramparts. And there are basically 3 times he goes to the edge of that space. And one is with the ghost. And he sort of, you could argue, goes metaphorically over the cliff with the ghost into this other world, to the graveyard, and then with the pirates, which is one of my favorite parts of Hamlet. We haven't mentioned the pirates, but, pirates, what genre are we in? But that's it. How do you escape from that poisoned castle? And then the end of the play, we go right back into the depths of that poisoned space. So I started thinking about the imagination as maybe partly on the outside of that, the pales and forts of reason that are this castled space. And when Hamlet can get outside, like to the graveyard even, he has this sort of imaginative space where he can maybe cope with death differently, or he gets to go to a whole other genre, a pirate romance, and that's great. Or even with a ghost, he goes into this world of the uncanny. So I don't know what you think about that, but whether you think that staging-wise there's a way that the court is sort of like this kind of poisoned, corrupted mind. And Hamlet is almost the sort of embodiment of it in a way. And he can't leave his poisoned mind behind till he can somehow get out of it. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
That's
But
very good point.
Play called the Hamlet.
Yeah. Well, that's true. I hadn't thought of that.
What you said?
The Hamlet machine.
Heine Müller.
Heinrich Müller, yeah.
Olivia's movie opens with the court.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he plays the ramparts. It's very much that border space.
Right.
I think the time has come to open this out from the, as it were, the court of the Roundtable, which Hamlet repeatedly calls a prison, out into the larger world.
Yeah, you've got to come up to the mic. You've got to say who you are, and let us know.
I speak loudly, can't I just say?
No, we record you. You're being broadcast.
Hi.
Good luck.
Hi. I am Paula Young. I am an actress. I'm also an author. And two things. One, the twin situation with Shakespeare, he lost the boy. That would be the most reason to me. He lost his boy, not a girl. Ergo, at that time, losing your boy had to be far greater an impact. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was the misogynistic statement that you made. Actually, I'm not going to comment. That's too complicated. But the little bit of argument I noticed between the two of you with the parapraxis and the Freudian, it was very interesting to watch all of you and know a little bit about each of you, because each of you brought exactly who you are to your argument. And so I thought it was interesting because she brought anxiety and she mentioned it. You brought parapraxis and you mentioned it. And it was just very interesting to watch. And so then I think, so when Shakespeare writes, he's obviously a great observer. And humans all make slips of tongues for centuries, forever. And so how better to let you know as the audience what the actor wants to tell you, if not by double entendre or by slips of tongue. And so that's my point. But this was brilliant. Thank you.
Anyone care to
You have to walk to the microphone there.
Hi, my name is Eddie Liu. I'm a director. And I think everything that was being said was fascinating. But I was watching Christian's face, and it's the worst thing you can do at a rehearsal, to do this. And because there are two Hamlets. There's the person who plays the Hamlet, and there's everybody else who has theories on it. But I just wanted to make that comment. Like, I love the look on your face. But because it's black and white. Ultimately, it's black and white when you're directing something. But there were just two things I wanted to say, and that is, Mr. Mahon, yeah, you said you. I think the secret of the Freudian thing is that they were observers, and they didn't have the context then of understanding, well, that was a Freudian slip, but they had observed that people do this every once in a while, and they just, I go through, I love Charles Dickens, and I go through all his plays, and I marvel at I said, how did he know these things, as melodramatic as he is? There are a lot of truths in, psychological truths.
If you look at the New York Times, it frequently has articles about why Freud was wrong with the slips of the tongue. So I don't think people bought that so readily.
But
before or since
yeah,
him.
but I think they observed, well, maybe not necessarily that, but they observed certain patterns people did. But I remember discussing this with just a friend of mine who was totally unintellectual lady about Dombey and Son, and I said, how did Dombey's daughter, the opening scene, is so upset because she's taking on the guilt that she killed her mother. And I said, how did Charles Dickens figure this out? And she just said, well, he was an observer. He just noticed that children do that. And I think that's they didn't have the context that we have now. I think that's a lot of the answer. Now, the other thing is, does anybody know Bernard Grabiner's book, The Heart of Hamlet? Oh, you should look at it. Yeah. It's a strictly analytical discussion of the practicality. Hamlet has no proof whatsoever until the very end that he can break to the court that his father... Right. And that's really, that's what he's talking about. That's the simple... That's where Hamlet is in such agony, is that he knows, but he can't let it out. And he analyzes it. It's big fat, but also the plays in it. But it's an incredible book. It opened my eyes to all this discussion, which is fabulous. It's fascinating. But when you're directing the play, it's literally about I can't tell anybody yet. I don't know. I can't tell the court my father killed my stepfather killed. He'll be arrested. But anyhow, it's I loved every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bruce LaRue, an analyst from Washington. Again, I think the discussion was wonderful. When in the social situation and people say, and I observe something comes up about a slip, and they damn Freud by saying, "Oh, that's just that Freudian idea of slip." My retort is, it's a human nature slip. Right. And someone could figure this out way from eternity. And I even wonder if there's some parallel in more honored in the breach, the kind of unconscious or having other origins than in observance. When you can't the controversy, you can't analyze a character or the playwright, but you can use associations to weave something on a non-existent person and use the analytic method to put
like in a dream interpretation, to get some ideas. And the other distinction that people, I think, sometimes aren't aware of is between using analysis to interpret or speculate and to treat. You're not talking about treating, you're just talking about a form of understanding. And the last thing, the parallel to go to Oedipus, what did Jocasta know? Jocasta knew a great deal. The age of her son, the resemblance, assumedly a resemblance to a son, the fact that she didn't know that he was killed, and he was very bright. I mean, there are so many hints that she had to know.
Just to respond to you, Bruce, I think once you talk about speculating, be my guest. But don't think of it as anything else but speculating.
I totally agree. I should add, too, that I think you can psychoanalyze the playwright, because the playwright is a real, full-bodied entity. I'm saying you can't psychoanalyze the character, because the character is the creation of the playwright. And what you're doing is providing all the material that the playwright, for either for voluntary or involuntary reasons, has left out. That's what I'm saying.
My name's Barbara Meister, and I'm really just a student. I was just wondering how you reconcile the obvious misogyny in certainly Winter's Tale and in Hamlet with some of the wonderful, wonderful women in the earlier plays, Rosalind and Beatrice and Viola. I mean, they're so strong. They're wonderful.
And also the women in his later plays who were all daughters. The reconciliation between father and daughter that happens in those later plays.
Leontes coming around is probably because of, I can't remember her name.
Hermione. Perdita.
Yes, Perdita.
Yeah. Also, you get the same thing in Cymbeline. You get the same thing between Prospero and Miranda. That is he not thinking of his own relationship with his daughter or daughters at that particular time as well?
Well, it's not a progression because in Winter's Tale she's so strong and she brings Hermione back and brings Leontes back to his senses. Yeah.
But to answer your question, the demands of the play demand that, and we know Shakespeare didn't invent any plots. He invented great language, he invented great characters, but he stole all of his plots. And the plot of As You Like It demands that Rosalind, and plot of Twelfth Night demands that Viola be very attractive women. And he's perfectly capable of writing those women.
Exactly. That's why I think you can call Hamlet misogynist, and Polonius too, for that matter, but I don't think you can really be sure to call Shakespeare misogynist.
Laura?
No, I just wanted to say your question, how can you reconcile? I think it's a great question. Yeah. The plays themselves I think of as antitheses on the one hand. On the other hand, they are embodiments of contradictions. They, or you use the word interlocutory, they meditate on opposed sets of propositions, it seems to me, and they often embody them as well.
And also, can I just add? I just want to add that there's misogynist tendencies and misogynist, instincts sometimes, but it doesn't mean he's a misogynist. Right. So that's an important distinction. To
look at the sonnets. Yeah. The real Shakespeare is in the sonnets. I mean, Will is in the sonnets under his own name. And under his own name, he is a misogynist.
He doesn't like certain women.
He doesn't like the woman he's sleeping with very
Do you
much.
sympathize with Kate or Peruchio?
That's true, yes.
Thank you. This gentleman's been waiting a long time. Then this gentleman and then you, okay?
Yeah.
I'm Erwin Flaxman, and I'm a psychoanalyst and a teacher of literature. My question is going to be about, I'm going to label it Exit the Prince. But before I ask that question of all of you, I'd like to weigh in a little bit on this question of the psychology of the character and Shakespeare. It's a danger, I think, that Professor Brustein says is a great danger in naturalizing a character in a play. And there's a kind of a historic problem we have in that what we consider modern psychology which inevitably we have to bring to the play, I think we have to bring it with a great deal of caution. The other thing I'd like to say is that any character is a product of a transformation. Whatever the fantasy that may undergird or have been the source of creating that character, it's undergone so much transformation, and from an inner world to the demands of an outer world, which brings me to my next observation about the question of twinning. I think that it was a convention of the age that if you look at a lot of drama previous to Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, there was an enormous taste for characters mirroring each other. Now, it's a very interesting question why that would be the case, but I think from a theatrical side, and this I think I'm following Stephen Booth, is that the alliteration really contains the complexity of the play. And from the audience's perspective, it's a way of making sense of what's going on in the play. Now, exit the prince. And going back to Shakespeare and the imagination. How satisfying is it to all of you, the way the play ends? Now, clearly it ends according to a lot of conventions of the age. But I guess this is a two-part question, is Hamlet's who's more, let me put it a little differently, it's hard. I think that Hamlet's has a much more imaginative conclusion to the play than Shakespeare does. That it's not a terribly satisfying ending, except in my reading beyond the play, I like the idea that the Polish poet says that Fortinbras comes on the stage and has to clean it all up, that everyone's made a great mess, and Hamlet's been able to play the tragic prince, and now Fortinbras has to get the pipes working and the sewers working in Elsinore. But in any case, I wonder if there is a lapse in Shakespeare's imagination at the end of the play. Now, again, plays have to end. There were a lot of conventions. There were certain demands that expectations on the part of the audience, and everybody had to go home. So it had to end in some way. But I wonder if you'd reflect on that.
I wonder if I could say something about in response to that, because my feeling is that when Hamlet dies and then Horatio sums up the events, what we know is that summary is completely inadequate. It doesn't really describe all the things that happened. It doesn't, and so what dies with Hamlet is the full knowledge of the story, which is only resident in the audience at that point. There's nobody else on stage that knows all the things that we know. So on the one hand, it seems to me we feel an enormous sense of grief, not just at the loss of this particular person, but at the loss of the richness of the understanding and the experience that's gone. And what's left is this very kind of bang, bang, bang. There's not very much complexity left in the world. So there's a real sense of greatness having been taken from us. And except in the sense that we replay Hamlet again and again in our imagination, or over and over, night after night on the stage, when that will come back, we are always in this sense of grief and loss. But I wouldn't describe that as a weakness of Shakespeare's imagination. I would see it as that's really what he builds in for us. He builds in the reality that when Hamlet goes, that the greatness of that imagination is not there, and we have to experience that in a very visceral way by seeing how limited what Horatio says is, how Fortinbras is really probably a disaster for Denmark, and it's not a great thing. And so I wouldn't see that as, I see what you're suggesting, is that there's a clunkiness to that moment, but I think we're supposed to respond to it.
By the time of King Lear, he does it much better than.
Well, I'd just like to add to what Susanne is saying.
Really young will never see so much or live so long.
What does that mean?
The last lines are notoriously anticlimactic. Most characteristically in epic and in the short story, oddly enough, in which the last line is typically a dying fall. Probably go bid the soldiers shoot after everything we've been through is one of the dullest, least imaginative seeming lines on record, unless, the fascist Fortinbras is on the horizon, and there's a certain symbolism in "Go bid the soldiers shoot."
Shoots everybody on stage.
Yeah, and we feel ourselves being opened up into a different kind of and an even more unpleasant world, and I think that's what you're suggesting too.
I've never thought of it exactly as failure of imagination, but I think there's a redundancy built into the fifth act that begins long before. If this doesn't work, let's try this. We've got some backup poison. If that doesn't work, there's somebody hanging in the wings. It's as if there won't really be anything to end this story. And to me, it's always felt less like, I don't know, as if the redundancy really means something, as if the redundancy is an indication of how difficult it is to resolve this story on any terms.
Thank you.
I'm Herb Schlesinger, one more analyst, who doesn't think it's fair, however, to analyze people who can't fight back.
I hope your patients don't fight back.
They can if they don't, they can't stay.
Okay.
But I have a question that I've never been able to answer about Hamlet. Why didn't he succeed to the throne? Where does Claudius come into it? And no one has ever answered that for me, so I'll raise it with you.
Well,
another issue I'd like to raise is Hamlet, like Oedipus, is a man in the grip of a vow that must be carried out. And it's clear in Oedipus that he squirms all his way to the bitter end where he can't help himself but fulfill the prophecy. The same thing, I think, is true of Hamlet. He's stuck on a vow he doesn't want to fulfill, but has to. And as to whether he knew or not, somebody at the very outset, when Hamlet said, "What's going on here on the ramparts?" said, they knew something was rotten in the state of Denmark, that this was not news to anybody except perhaps Hamlet.
Very good.
Well, these are great questions, and I'll just jump in on one of them. One of the questions that Mack lists in his list of questions about the play is, why is Hamlet not king? And there are a number of historical answers that you can give to it, but I think ultimately you're left with the sense that he says about Claudius as having popped in between the election and his hopes. So one of the answers historically is that Denmark, like Ireland and like Scotland, still used the system that's called tanistry, which was a system of an elected kingship. And actually, a very, very common person who would have been elected is the brother of the king when the king died. It was not you remember at the end of Macbeth where Malcolm, I guess it is, says, "I'm going to be creating some dukes and earls." And what he's really saying is I'm going to be putting in an inherited notion of a feudal aristocracy where the son would inherit from the father. But the previous system had been this other system, and it's alluded to in Hamlet very indirectly. Apparently, the common system in tanistry was that when the ruler would die, the person elected would be viewed as the most able male. And that wouldn't always be the son, because the son might be very young or whatever. So it's not actually
reinforced by public acclaim, not by ballot, but by public acclaim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of historical echo there, but the play isn't consistent that it's really that kind of thing. So there's also this sense that there's just something that was improper. And you're left, I think, without being able to resolve that fully.
I lack advancement. Mm-hmm.
Right. I lack advancement.
Right.
Exactly.
Go ahead. And then the young.
I'm Wynn Jackson. I'm an analyst affiliated with Columbia. Do the panelists think that the ghost was a product of Hamlet's imagination? And
too many people see him.
Okay, well, you answered that one.
Unless they're all hallucinating.
Okay. And for the people who might disagree with that, how would you think that would tie in with Hamlet's mental state? For example, would some people think that he had a psychotic depression as a result of his loss?
I think the reverse of the question is at least as interesting. Why doesn't Gertrude see him?
Yeah.
And isn't that evidence that maybe your opinion is not the only one?
Only in that scene. Only in that scene, because others do see him.
Well, Bernardo sees him, and Marcella sees him, and Horatio sees him, and it's,
I wonder if we could tell the story that Laura alluded to earlier. There was a woman in the audience who saw a play that had a ghost and immediately interpreted it as the ghost of her husband. And made exactly that sort of...
She's a murderer, and she spontaneously confesses.
Right. So I think there were examples in the period of people who saw ghosts on stage and not only thought they were real, but thought they were the actual ghost of someone they had killed or of their beloved.
Can I just go back to this gentleman's question about the Oedipus as well, just briefly? One thing that I haven't heard it yet, and a lot of people question a bit, is he is burdened with a task, right, from this father figure, from this ghost. But it's added on with an instruction which says, "Taint not your mind."
Yeah.
Find this proof, but taint not your mind.
Right. And don't give your mother too hard a time.
And don't give your mom too hard a time. Taint not your mind, to me, was interpreted in a way, you cannot murder without just, you can't do all these steps, you need the proof. Right. So I felt that throughout the journey of Hamlet, that he was driving to find this, to follow this instruction to the utmost, and it wasn't really until the end that he gets the actual proof. So I don't feel like he's just sort of without his faith just sort of streaming along by this curse from the ghost, but that he actually has a very strict instruction, taint not your mind, which I think is the reason why we go through the 3 hours of the play. Really.
Because he doesn't know.
He doesn't know, and then he can't.
First of all, in light of your... my name's Leo. Thank you. My name's Leo Schaff. Leo, I'm an actor, and I teach some Shakespeare as well. In light of your anecdote about Bergman's production, I was once upon a time in a very strange production, rewriting of Hamlet that took place on the Texas-Mexico border. It was called El Sonore. Amongst other roles, I played Fortinbras, and the way the play ended was Fortinbras was like a Pancho Villa kind of character, and we came on stage and barked some lines in Spanish and pulled out the teeth of the bodies that were there, took off their spurs, and rode off into the distance. So just another curious ending. A couple of comments on this wonderful discussion you've all had today. The twinning... when you brought up the subject of Hamlet dying and what about his sister, you had pointed out that he was writing Twelfth Night at the same time as Hamlet. Right. And I thought maybe that was just an interesting kind of comment, because we think of violence, Sebastian, and the twinning that goes on there. So I thought of that in light of your mentioning that they wrote at the same time. The other point about the... I forgot your name, but about the what's the term? The slip of the tongue? Yeah. Parapraxis? I'm having a slip of the tongue. And the whole subject of psychoanalysis, and I think you mentioned that it wouldn't be appropriate to analyze a character because there are omissions, there are things that are left out. Well, in analysis, I don't know whoever has been in, are there not omissions and things that we leave out? And can we say that we tell our therapist absolutely everything? Or how many years does it take to tell them everything? In other words, you don't necessarily get a complete picture there either, I think. I just sort of thought that was a point. And really the last thing, and really it's the first thing that I wanted to bring up, because this whole theme had to do with imagination. And I know in the popular imagination, Hamlet is to be or not to be in that soliloquy. But the Ode to Rogue soliloquy, which is to be every bit as central, if not more so, and goes so much to the core of imagination, especially when he says that about the soul and from her working. I have to open it up to look at it a second. That this play here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit, that from her working all his visage wand, etc., etc., his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing for Hecuba. I wondered if some of you could talk about the word conceit as meaning imagination, but more really what it might have meant in an Elizabethan context, conceit and soul, because he says soul there and he says conceit, and then at the very end of the soliloquy he also says about criminals revealing themselves, and the soul, he refers to soul as well. So I just wondered if you might touch on that in light of the larger picture of imagination, theatricality, seeming. How much time do we have? Okay, thank you.
I actually am beginning to think that there's a method in the scattered madness of the remarks that I've been making, and I don't think that the method is very admirable or going to be very popular, and I myself would fight back against it if I had time. But I think what I meant by beginning in talking about the intellectual framework of the play was actually to distance myself, not for Hamlet, not at all necessarily for other Shakespeare plays or plays in general or as a matter of theory, but for Hamlet to distance myself from the notion of a stable character and to feel that both the exhilaration and the occasional frustration that I experience in recycling Hamlet from time to time has to do with what I take to be this volatile, constructive, productive, dynamic instability of, not of character necessarily, because I think that everything we've been saying suggests that we go there in a very gingerly fashion, but of what I call intellectual framework, and that spans the connection between the imagination of Hamlet, the character, and the imagination of Shakespeare, understood perhaps, as Susanne was saying, in Maynard Mack's terms, as the world of Hamlet. That this is an unstable world, historically as much as psychologically, and that's what we're getting with particularly full force in Hamlet.
Can I add one more thing that we have not really emphasized enough, and that is that with the death of Hamlet, his son Hamlet, because the names are interchangeable, he was named after Hamlet Sadler, who called himself either Hamlet or Hamlet. But with the death of Hamlet, Shakespeare's name was dead. There was his name would never be heard again. All three brothers died in the plague, Gilbert, Edmund, and Richard. And I don't know if I imagined this, but in my play, I don't never know when I steal or when I imagine. I usually steal. I have Judith wanting to name her firstborn Shakespeare Quiney.
Shakespeare who?
Quiney. She's marrying this man, Quiney, against Shakespeare's wishes, because he's a younger man, and he's also been involved with another woman who died in childbirth. And Susanna then says, I could name my child Shakespeare Hall. And he said, well, it sounds too much like an Oxford dormitory. But nevertheless, everyone's trying to maintain this name Shakespeare, which is dead. Even Davenant, is trying to represent himself as Shakespeare's bastard child, although he doesn't call himself Shakespeare. So this is a very important thing, I think, which may even be affecting the writing of the play Hamlet.
Right. Well, I think this young lady was first.
So my name is Aneta Mancewicz, and I'm a professor from Poland. I'm a visiting scholar at CUNY here. Thank you for this discussion, and I think it's very interesting for me, particularly that I've been working on Hamlet in the context of the psychological, romantic reading and deconstruction of that reading in contemporary drama. And what I think you're very much advocating is in the tradition of Bradley, Bloom, and it's very much influenced by Freud, Jones, Lacan, and so on. And I would like to suggest maybe a different way of looking at Hamlet. We would completely go against that grain. And some of you mentioned here Heine Müller and Hamlet Machine. And I think this is a play which very much deconstruct that notion of Hamlet as a psychological unity. Because I think what's going on in this discussion is this idea of Shakespeare as a genius who never makes mistakes. Now, there are those who claim that there are certain mistakes in Hamlet. Jan Kod is saying that we have actually grown to look at Hamlet as a badly written masterpiece. And for instance, T.S. Eliot obviously has it with Hamlet. So we have some, and Margherita de Grazia, for instance, is arguing against this tradition of looking at Hamlet as a play just about Hamlet and seeing Hamlet in context. So I think there is a lot of there's a lot happening in criticism that is going against this tradition. There is so much going in drama, and Heine Müller, I think, is maybe the most famous example of that, with an actor coming at the beginning saying, "I'm not Hamlet," right? And then he says, he says first, "I was Hamlet." Later he says, "I'm not Hamlet, I'm not playing any role anymore." And if you look at theater, for instance, and the Worcester Group Hamlet, which premiered, I think, 2008, which doesn't have really Hamlet. I mean, it's not important if you're analyzing this play to know exactly what he's thinking, to psychoanalyze the character, to psychoanalyze the author. And I would like us maybe to, if you could maybe refer to that, to look at this character and the author in a kind of deconstructive, more non-psychoanalytical, non-romantic way, and what we could get out of it, and how maybe we can get out of psychoanalytical room and go other places.
I guess what I'm realizing is that I was surprising myself by taking that side of the question, but also willing to fight back against myself. I mean, we have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern dead. We also have, by Joyce's proclamation, the wonderful play performed in the provinces of France, Hamlet ou le Prince, with the part with the part of the prince left out by popular demand.
But I do think, there's a wonderful postmodern tradition of rewritings of Hamlet of all sorts, and the Worcester Group's interpretation of it, was itself a meditation on the play as much as a replaying of the play. But I'm not sure that necessarily changes the question of the way that we look at the play itself. And I think that you're certainly right that I myself am not engaged in psychoanalyzing Hamlet, but I think that, let's see if I can respond to this in a useful sense. My feeling is that you need the illusion of character in order to ask a lot of the questions that the play wants us to ask. And if the question that the play wants us to ask is the illusion of character, even the illusion that we have coherent characters, that there is such a thing as character, and that human beings are structured, that we have our narratives and our journeys, and that we know what they are. All of those things are the questions the play wants us to meditate on, and a great performance of it will raise those questions. So it means that those are valid issues, even if you decide that the play answers them negatively. So I think this is sort of what Bob was saying, is that this isn't a real person, and let's not make that mistake, and let's understand that. But at the same time, the question of what is a real person is part of what the play allows us to ask.
The Worcester Group was very good on this subject because it showed you a Hamlet in conjunction with a Hamlet from the past that was
and a lot
filmed.
of melancholia in that, no?
And when you think of all these Hamlets, I mean, there was a time when Leslie Howard and John Gielgud were both doing Hamlet on Broadway simultaneously.
Right. I mean, my reaction...
And there have been about 50 Hamlets since then.
Right.
Which is Hamlet? I mean, they're all Hamlet.
Right.
And the notion that there is a single Hamlet...
is a false one.
Through criticism or through acting is false.
But
that's the beauty of
I think
theater.
what she was saying was a very, very interesting point to bring up, and you just said it, about the nature of the modern construction of what we think personality to be, actually.
Right.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, Stacy Keach, do you remember that, Bob? Stacy Keach did Hamlet at the Long Wharf?
Yes.
I actually wrote a review of it. It was sort of like, it was a meta-Hamlet almost. I mean, it was. I don't even know if he realized what was going on. Maybe some people thought it was a bad, they didn't like it, but it was sort of, I said Hamlet in absentia, that was what it was, but it was a very odd, very modernistic view of what personality was.
Yeah.
You did it after playing your role, Coriolanus.
May I ask a question? I'm an electrical engineer, so go easy on me. Thank you so much.
Shocking statement.
Here's what's on my mind. When Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, it came from his imagination. When Ed analyzes I'll call him a customer, patient, he's looking very often at what a person's dreams are. So I'm thinking that maybe there's not a big difference between an imagination and a dream. Now, Ed will want to analyze a dream to find out about the man who dreamt it. Shakespeare's play came from his mind and imagination. So I'm sort of going to the point where I'm beginning to think you can analyze the characters in the play, and why not? So I'm on the side of the people who say you can analyze the characters in a play. Thank you.
I think that goes straight to Dr. Mahon's point, because the analogy between the literary work and the dream has often been worked with and investigated. And of course, Freud's tendency when turning to literary works was to analyze them in that way. But at the same time, we take it that there is the question of craft, art, authorial control, which makes us need to look for Freudian slips, for parapraxes, if we are analytically inclined, whereas the dream, with its presumed absence of censorship, is open to the sort of analysis that the work of art actually tends rather strenuously to resist, it with a kind of set of defenses that need to be broken through.
I don't think that's true of modern drama. I mean, modern drama, being realistic, is causal. The psychoanalysis is causal. And you can certainly make equivalences there. Strindberg, for example, is very open to analysis, incredibly open to analysis. In fact, he's analyzing himself on the stage, analyzing his own madness. Ibsen's open to analysis. Chekhov is open to analysis. But before this, the causality of the play is not that important. And there are lots of lapses and ellipses and contradictions in plays that we should accept, because the playwright, quite often Shakespeare, is not that interested in being consistent. He's interested in something else, quite often in electrifying the audience, but it's not the inconsistency of character all the time.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the...
Who are you?
I'm Adam Ludwig. I work here. I wanted to follow up, and I'm an actor as well, on the question about deconstructions or reconstructions of Hamlet. My favorite production of Hamlet, by far, was a deconstruction by Robert Wilson. And what I think about that production brings some insight into this discussion is that it begins with Hamlet's last line, which is his very last line. What is the last line?
The rest is silence.
The rest is silence. And it's the moment when he dies, and it's on the idea that when you die, there's a moment where your whole life kind of passes in front of you. So the rest of the play, it's almost as if he takes excerpts, throws them up into the air, and kind of grabs at all these moments from the play. And Robert Wilson played all the roles. It was a one-person production. And so he takes lines of all of the characters, and why I think it's insightful is that maybe that's what the play is, in a way, is it's not an objective story of Hamlet. It's Hamlet's imagination, literally. The play is Hamlet's imagination of what has happened to him, so that the idea of, is the ghost real? Well, objectively, yeah, the other guards see it. But this is Hamlet's imagination. It's his retelling of his incredible journey. And that's why in that particular production, for example, I saw the love between Hamlet and Ophelia was more poignant, and it felt more real than in any other production where they're striving to objectify it as a kind of objective relationship. It was Hamlet's feelings about Ophelia as he imagined them and as she exists inside of him.
And then Laura has a question for you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question. Hi, I'm Rebecca Curtis, a psychoanalyst. I'd just like to hear a few more ideas about why this play is so haunting. I think it's the most famous play in the Western world, and you were talking about the identity and not knowing exactly what's going to happen. I was thinking also about when is it right to hurt somebody else, but there's something about this play that does grip the imagination, and I'd just like to hear some more ideas because I'm not familiar with the literary criticism on it.
Well, I might jump in and say that what you were saying to me rings really true, which is that it's the search for wanting to know the truth in order to be able to act. And that makes Hamlet a moral character. And he is not willing to commit murder without knowledge. And how do you actually get knowledge? And when you add that to knowledge that's about your parents, and can you ever know the truth about your parents? And can you ever really know? And that's why I also think that comment that Adam just made about the Robert Wilson production is really interesting, because Hamlet is filled with these moments. The ghost says, if only I could tell you all about the horrors, but I can't tell you, I got to get going. And then Hamlet, he's about to die, he says to Horatio, if this Sergeant Death didn't stop me, I could tell you, I'm right on the border of death, and I can tell you what I see beyond the grave, but, sorry, I got to die. Rest in silence. And so that sense that you can't know, but you need to know in order to act, seems to me to be this kind of gripping drama. I don't know. What you said is pushing through, trying to reach that moment where you can say, I can commit the murder. In the end, he doesn't commit the murder. He lets it himself be the agent that commits it, because he cannot know certainly until that final scene. That's at least, I don't know where our questioner went, but that's at least something that I find very gripping.
Here's what Joyce says about the importance of the play, in a way. Because the theme of the false or the usurping or the adulterous brother, or all three, is one, all three in one, is to Shakespeare what the poor is not always with him. I need my glasses, I'm sorry. I don't know what I seem to have misplaced. Here they are. Sorry to hold you up, but this is worth reading, I think. Always with him. He puts Bohemia on the seacoast and makes Ulysses quote Aristotle. Why? Because the theme of the false or the usurping or the adulterous brother of all three is is to Shakespeare what the poor is not always with him. The note of banishment from the heart, banishment from home, sounds uninterruptedly from the Two Gentlemen of Verona onward till Prospero breaks his staff, buries it certain fathoms in the earth, and drowns his book. It doubles itself in the middle of his life, reflects itself in another, repeats itself, protasis, epitasis, catastasis, catastrophe. It repeats itself again when he is near the grave, when his married daughter, Susan, chip of the old block, is accused of adultery. But it was the original sin that darkened his understanding, weakened his will, and left in him a strong inclination to evil.
Stephen, time for a drink.
We have
two questions. Two quick questions.
I wanted to give one other answer. It's a very bad answer, but it's so striking. I can never sort of get rid of it. Lamb and Hazlitt both wrote a lot about Hamlet, and Hazlitt said of all of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet was the one you should never put on a stage, that it should never be acted. And his reason was, we are Hamlet. And Lamb said something that to me is even more extraordinary. He said that we put up with epistolary novels, with novels that are written in letter form, to get at Clarissa. And in the same way, we put up with the fact that Hamlet is in words to get Hamlet. So what do people imagine about Hamlet? You know, that they have to sort of suffer the encumbrances of the fact that it's in words instead of, I don't know, just being injected intravenously or something. I mean, that's a testament to the play's power. I don't know what it means to say that. But,
I'm not sure this microphone is working, but I just want to chime in.
Who are you?
Who am I? I'm Fred Sander, psychoanalyst and with a special interest in theater. I just wanted to chime in for a moment on this question that's been running around about what could people write before Freud about, in quotes, Freudian ideas like parapraxis and things like that. I just wanted to remind everyone that Freud, we're putting the cart before the horse.
Yes.
Freud, I think, in his own writing said that, probably didn't put it as concretely as this, but had there never been a Shakespeare, had there never been a Dostoevsky, there never would have been psychoanalysis. That he gave the credit to his insights to the great creative artists that have been with us since the ancient Greeks.
Good point.
So now, Laura has a question for Ed, and I think we'll end on that note.
Mike, wait.
Sorry.
Should I go or should I go?
My name is Barry. I'm an actor and writer. I think you mentioned a phrase a few minutes ago that I think we should remember. And he said sometimes you just want to electrify the audience. Maybe some of the things that we're discussing was just to get an audience that was going to be going down the hall, down the block to bear baiting, and just decided to excite everybody. The end of Hamlet may have been, okay, I'm just going to give you a whole lot of death. And sometimes, maybe we're over-analyzing everything, and sometimes it's just instinct. You just want to have fun or excitement and want to electrify an audience.
That explains why 9 people are taken off for his father's one. That's Joyce says. 9
Go ahead,
deaths.
say what you want. There's an imbalance here, I feel. I'm a director about Hamlet, about why Hamlet, and I'll only talk about why it appeals to me, and that is I've read it so many times and I've seen it so many times. That last section between Horatio and Hamlet will always bring tears to my eyes. It's a combination of the character, if you find a really appealing Hamlet, and the great poetry. And if that you can do that to your audience, that's what it's about. I mean, it's not about ideas and thoughts. People will walk out moved, and I want people to understand that's really what it's about. I think that's what Shakespeare wanted. He was a commercial playwright. Right. I think what he wanted you to do. He wanted you to walk out moved, and not. Yeah, I mean, you can talk about it later, but I think at that moment he wanted you to be moved, and I think that's why Hamlet is so beautiful.
One more, but then we have
Laura too.
Stuart Dambrot. I'm a physiological psychologist. This is extending the comments around, especially one of the more recent ones, about the foundational aspects of playwrights, authors, and so on in significantly pre-psychoanalytic contexts. Do you think there's any validity to a perspective that looks at this as psychoanalysis in that his son died? One characteristic of youth is its unfettered imagination. And I was thinking if I could somehow divorce my thoughts that are based on analysis and place myself in that context, and I wanted to have an externalized way of dealing with the grief and dealing with my understanding of he who is lost, I could see that it would be quite a natural extension for a creative, intuitive, observational individual like we're purporting Shakespeare to be, rightfully so, to come up with a scenario where imagination is trapped within the walls, if you will, of the restrictive nature of rational thought, and to have that dynamic act itself out in the only way it could, in my view, in reading the play in that context. Any comments?
Good point.
Yeah. Certainly.
Laura, did you want to ask?
I did. I don't know how to formulate this, and a lot of people have already circled around it, so I want to subtract some things. Leaving out parapraxes of characters, leaving out a kind of developmental model, leaving out psychoanalyzing character. I wanted to go back to what I think was maybe half the heart of your point, which was that Shakespeare couldn't somehow have anticipated Freud. And I want to ask you whether the test of that wouldn't be essentially how many matches there are. That is, how many features that look like condensation or overdetermination. That is, wouldn't the test be how many similarities there were? It's not a question about treatment or about character. It's just whether you think that match is a sort of testable, possible way of thinking about things.
I'm not sure I understand the question well, but I am assuming that most of what Freud described existed obviously long before him, but he developed a theory about those, and that theory is the psychoanalytic theory, and that theory can only get verified at each point with one patient on one couch in one office. Anything else you do beyond that would be speculative, would be applying that theory. Very interesting ways you can do it, and people do it all the time. But that's not what the essence of psychoanalysis is. And the more you practice it, the more you realize how often you can be wrong with your first or second or third understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. I wasn't so much thinking about verifiability as the contours of what both writers imagine in a way, and I suppose maybe now that you put it that way, wondering about the final verifiability even for a psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
But isn't this dialogue a restatement, not reduction of the tension in the play, in that he's dealing with intuition and imagination internally versus the rationalistic need for logical extensions and proof? I mean, that was that dialogue we just had in essence.
I wanted to conclude by reminding everyone, should they have any money, that there are for sale in the lobby copies of our books.
Right, for sale here.
I thought they were going to say they have any money.